Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Harder They Fall. So, this, of course, is a Netflix film that really is to be another Western film. I say another Western film because that's honestly what it feels like, just another Western film. There's nothing unique about it, there's nothing that really is too like in comparison of like a Django Unchained or a High Noon or a Silverado or really just any number of Western movies that anybody could come and pop into mind. Really, this movie just heavily has to rely on star power, and really, there's not much else besides a revenge story, which doesn't feel all that like satisfying when eventually we kind of break down this whole entire film. There might be some kind of interesting visual things that probably come out of this film, or there might be some approaches at some point in time with this film, like the Crimson Gang that gets represented in this movie, or just like certain kind of things. But really, overall, this kind of is a forgettable Western film. When really looking at it, I would probably want to go back and rewatch movies like Django Unchained or High Noon, the Gene Hackman movie, or just other things that are the Hateful Eight, and so on and so forth, to just kind of get a more unique Western experience when it really comes down to Western films. Because for the longest time, we ended up just doing a Western style of movie, which eventually kind of look at almost any Nicolas Cage film, and that's like a Western style kind of film, um, but not an actual Western film. So yeah, so going into this, we have like another Netflix movie that is to just be kind of like a very flat film, and really just doesn't really ever pick up or like continue to have my interest. There might be some interesting things where eventually Idris Elba is to be introduced in this movie. Funny finding out that evidently Idris Elba, I guess, was allergic to horses, and so evidently he was, I guess, doing an interview at some point and mentioning that he was kind of allergic to ride a horse, and like he had to ride it for a certain kind of portion of this film. So going into this film, yeah, it was just uh, kind of one of these one-off revenge films where I don't know we'll actually get a sequel, or I don't know why it would probably like what would be the story for the sequel, because this just kind of feels like bottled within itself. And plus, Netflix is basically known for doing a ton of one-off movies where they never ever do a sequel because they just wanted in their portfolio that they did XYZ thing, and that's all that they really care about. Because really, just like there might be some horror movies that Netflix has put together that would have eventually gotten sequels, but like very rarely do we ever see. Uh, Maybe Fear Street would be like a franchise, but like they basically, it seems like they had those like in the can, like raring to go, quite quickly and easily. Like it seems like all of those movies were coming out with like a week within time, so it was kind of like they were tossing those movies all together. Um, but yeah, so for the most point, Netflix doesn't do sequels very all that often, but whichever. Anyways, pushing on. So going in this movie, like looking at even the revenge angle of this movie, it's like look at Death Wish. Like, does this really have a real gripping like revenge story? No. Does it just uh is it a story that really tweaks my interest? No, because there is at some points where there is to be really slow or drawn out parts because this is a 2 hour film. A 2 hour and change film nonetheless. So, what I say go into this film, I would say go and watch more unique Western films like what I had just mentioned, and then eventually go on this film because everybody is talking about it. Go on and watch this because it seems to be popular on Netflix, because that'll be the drawing factor of this movie, because that's always the drawing factor of every film. Because hey, whichever is the movie to easily click on because it's on the top of the rungs of whatever, like that's honestly always the kind of way of which that things eventually just get popular because they're in front of a row somewhere, or it's the newest, latest thing, and there's nothing good out. So without a doubt, let's go into that double five time territory because it's that customary time. Yet again, to go into spoiler time, it's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, very beginning of the film, we are to have, of course, uh, a character which I immediately cannot find. Isn't that great? Let me pause here for just 1 second so I can look. Okay, so this is hilarious. So the guy that actually plays Nat Love's father isn't even in IMDb. They don't even say that he's in this movie. Like I looked him up, I found out that the actor's name is actually Michael Beach because I've seen him in other things. I've seen him in like Red Dawn, the 2012 movie, and I saw him in, of course, in Lean on Me, and I'm like, so why isn't he in this movie as a credited thing? I even went into Michael Beach's IMDb to find out that he's not even accredited for this movie. So that's interesting. So I guess we're just gonna call him Nat's father to eventually gonna break this down. So yeah, let's just kind of because weirdly we have one person who ends up getting the credit, who is Eleanor Love, but not Michael Beach's character, who is to be uh, Nat Love's father. So I don't know what his actual name is because that would have been nice, but whatever. So I guess you just have to memorize things, memorize everyone's name. So mood point. So we end up having the Love family going and making some dinner and eventually gonna go and say their prayers. All of a sudden, excuse me, we have Idris Elba's character who is to make his way into this home, and Rufus Buck, and is to go and pull a gun or pull two guns out and point them at Nat Love's father's uh, table. Nat Love's father's like wife and kid. So Nat Love's father's uh, Nat Love's father is to tell Rufus, like, hey, like, your quarrels with me, don't go and kill these characters off. Because that's eventually what happens shortly thereafter. First, Rufus ends up shooting his wife, and then shooting Nat Love's father, and then just goes and puts a cross on the head using some like shaver, like a kind of razor, like old fashioned razor, to kind of cut this into this kid's forehead, and then eventually is to walk off, just kind of leaving him to, I guess, some time in the distant future going and seeking revenge, because why wouldn't he? So cue us going into X amount of years after this. So we have Nat Love, who is going to this church to eventually go uh, and seemingly talk to Jesus Cortez, I believe, to eventually have this guy seemingly wanting to uh, ask for a payout for this church. And Nat Love is just like, well, like, who would put a scorpion on their hand? Like, I can understand, like, eventually putting a snake there, like, but why a scorpion? It never made sense. So eventually Nat is to remove his hat to show the scar, and so the guys can realize who this guy is, and so Nat Love shoots him and kills him. So basically, Nat Love is to after his seemingly man that he had killed, the father is to come out, and Nat Love is to tell the father, "Hey, like, you can go and turn this guy in and get $5,000." And the guy is like, "Well, why don't you do it?" Because supposedly Nat Love is worth 10. So Nat Love eventually goes, or we'll just call him Nat weirdly, or we'll just call him Love, or we'll just call him Nah. We'll just call him La. Anyways, pushing on. So now Love goes back into town to go to the saloon, where we end up having a girl who is to be there, called Mary Fields, who is to be putting on this interesting performance where she kind of has this like white dot thing into her eyes. I'm like, what is with her with the whole like having this like white makeup done on her eyes? Like we end up having her in, like Deadpool 2, and she had to have the white on her eyes. Now we end up having it here, and I'm like, what is it going to be, a pattern that she consistently has to have some kind of like makeup like Domino? I don't know what that is. It's so weird. Why there's a pattern of that for whatever reason, but I guess it's just to kind of maybe nod at that for whatever goofy reason. Um, but anyways, there's this interesting song that is to come on. So, but eventually, all this does is really attach both Mary and Nat together. So while that is going on, we also have seemingly Bill Pickett, and we have also Jim Beckworth, who are going on and trying to fight the this Crimson Gang, and eventually killing them all off. Evidently, the Crimson Gang are to eventually be tied to Rufus Buck's kind of people, and so eventually we have this interesting moment where we have Damon Wayans Jr. having his mask, like he takes his mask off, and so like we have this kind of interesting kind of shootout moment in whichever, but eventually we have this guy who is to be taken to eventually have Bill go to Nate and say, hey, like, this guy needs to, like, you need to hear what this guy has to say. So Nate, who is to just be really, really annoyed with Bill because he ruined, like, their perfect timing of going at it, Nate goes off to eventually hear what this guy has to say, and of course, this guy is to kind of tell him that he has a connection with Rufus Buck's gang, and so that eventually that they are going to eventually break him out soon. So so we end up having characters. We end up having Coffee, who is to also be this kind of this bouncer at this saloon, and she's to basically tell guys that they can't hold on to their guns while coming to the saloon. And there is one guy who's like, well, I'd rather give up my right arm. And so she ends up starting to beat and clock them up, and I thought that was kind of funny. And so, like, people are to, of course, having to give up their weapons, like, because they don't want to deal with this woman and be beaten the crap out of. So now we push on and transition to a girl named Trudy Smith, who is played by Regina King. One thing that you have to say about this woman, she always comes in and kind of like, she always kind of like steals the show whenever she's in a room. Like, it always is to be that like obvious thing where like she always stands out, like even if she's not saying anything. Like there's something about her facial expressions, or there's something about the way like like body language or something like that, where like you just find Regina King always really interesting. Eventually, if she's not even saying a word, which is kind of really interesting. Like it would be interesting to see her um, kind of have a part where like she she has to kind of like through other kind of means which would work perfectly regardless to just kind of like represent how good of an actor she is and doesn't have to really say much. But anyways, um we have Trudy Smith and Cherokee Bill, who of course is going to free Idris Elba's character. They go on this train and they are to just kind of go through, and eventually they are to uh, eventually find themselves into these guys that look like they have like these northern Civil War-ish kind of outfits on, where I don't know the history of whatever time period this was, or I don't know what exactly like they're representing here, but it looks like the military, I would assess, because like this doesn't feel like a U.S. Marshal kind of outfit kind of thing, because they would just be wearing like, if you've seen Tombstone, like these aren't U.S. Marshals, so this has to be some kind of military-ish like outfit, weirdly, because I'm not quite sure of the time period or what's going on here. So eventually both these characters are to, of course, go through the train and kind of easily be very intimidating to where anybody would probably do whatever they are to have said. Like, it's not that they have the numbers on the against anyone. It's just that they have a better skill set than any number of these people. So, and they just have an intimidation factor, which is to immediately just persuade people to do whatever they want. So, plus people are kind of caught off guard because they're not like waiting for eventually someone to come flying through here. So, but coincidentally, the kid that is to be, of course, taken here is to coincidentally be tied to the General Abbott character, because he is to be his son, and to just be like, hey man, I'm going to shoot this kid unless you guys let us through here. And so General Abbott, of course, ends up letting them through. And so we had Trudy, who is to give this signed paper saying that Rufus, or Rufus, is it Rufus or Rufus? I want to say it's Rufus. Rufus is to be released, and so they end up doing so. And so immediately, Idris is to come out, and of course, this like prison outfit, this like black and white checkered thing. And you know what? I know that they wouldn't have had it, but like I think it would have actually been cool if he would have worn that throughout that whole entire time. Just be like, yeah, like I was in prison, and like guess what? I'm out. Like just to be like that, have like a real intimidation factor, that like he's going to wear these clothes as a symbol, as basically his freedom that he escaped. That like that would probably be very intimidating for a lot of people, like to wear your prison outfit as a way to just scare people. But like really, it's kind of interesting when eventually Idris does kind of change into whatever clothes that he's wearing, which I honestly think they kind of chucked his clothes together. Like it seems like there's a number of people where they made them look really good or really interesting, but like when it came down to Idris, they just kind of, here, chuck this on, just whatever. Like, hey, you're Idris Elba, so no one's gonna care what you're wearing or what you look like. Just put this on. Like, I don't even know if the clothes actually fit him. It didn't seem like those clothes actually fit him. It was weird. So, but pushing on. So especially the vest. The vest kind of rid like kind of really high. It was goofy. Anyways, pushing on. Maybe it was a thing of the time. Weirdly, I don't know why everybody has to have like a billion layers of like clothes on too, where you have to have like a three piece suit on to eventually go out anywhere. I'm like, good God, if it's not hot out, now you're wearing like a billion piece freaking suit. Why are you doing this? Man, no wonder probably a lot of people died in the early Western time because they were stupid. They wore too much clothes. They wore thick, like ridiculously thick clothing, and they wore way too many layers for a goofy reason that makes no sense. So I don't get it. This place wasn't probably all that cold either. It was probably hot as F out there. But anyways, pushing on. So eventually, Idris's character Rufus is to eventually just ask one of the guys, like, okay, who can actually drive a train? And one guy raised his hand, and so Rufus told the guys to kill everyone else. So they end up shooting through everyone else as Idris is just kind of walking through, just with his prison outfit on and his his guns in hand because he's not shooting anybody. So we transition on to eventually have Rufus's character eventually head into a town where he is going to basically just cement that it's like, hey man, I'm going to go and beat the out of somebody. So Idris is to go and call up the sheriff of this town, which is Wiley Esco, which is played by Dion Cole, which I'm like, oh my god, Dion Cole! Like, I haven't seen him in such a long time. Like, I remember him being on Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and like eventually he's doing all those like Old Spice commercials, I think. So he's doing some deodorant ad recently, so it's like, oh, okay, so maybe that spot kind of got him onto this movie, which, like, good for him. Like, good that he's kind of like going and like doing this kind of film. Plus, he plays a really fun, unique character. So Wiley Esco to be this sheriff that has had these like gold teeth, and I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And so Wiley is going and eating this steak, and he is like talking to supposedly Rufus uh, while he's eating this steak, and he's like, "You better get out of here before I finish up my steak." To all of a sudden find out that Rufus isn't actually here. Wiley is talking to nobody, and so like Wiley was trying to put up a really intimidating front, but no one was there. So eventually the guys are just like, well, hey man, Rufus is here to talk to you. And he's like, but I'm finishing up my dinner. And he's like, he doesn't care. So Wiley ends up going out and is to talk to Rufus. And so what ends up happening is Rufus ends up having to go and put his fists out and want to have a punch out contest with Wiley, which I'm like, okay, how like, I'm sorry, like Idris Elba and like Dion Cole, like, unless we have some like MMA kind of things going on in here, like I can see, like, no matter how big a person is, like you could still, like, there's still things to do, so to speak. But I'm like, this is Idris freaking Elba. I don't think he's gonna lose this match, sadly enough. So, but not only that, like, we have Rufus who just humiliates Wiley, and I just feel so bad for him. To where I'm kind of hoping for eventually him to have this like upswing at the end of the movie. So because eventually Rufus is to go and punch Wiley, but then like that's not good enough. Rufus gets this gun from somebody and takes the handle of the gun and just beats the crap out of Wiley. So I'm like, so wait a minute, like Rufus couldn't beat him with his own hands. He has to go and use this gun like a cheap move. But when really looking at Rufus's team, like they do a lot of underhanded, cheap stuff. Like when really looking at supposedly Cherokee Bill, who's to supposedly be this really fast draw character, we end up finding out how many times that he has kind of gone and shot somebody behind their back numerous times because it's an underhanded move. So, and then we just see just Trudy, who's just a very intimidating character, and you do not mess with this woman. So, like, it's not about like her, uh, it's not about the fact that she like needs to have something to do. It's that she like could just stand there, and you would just be like, okay, I'm afraid of this person. So it's interesting to eventually see the battle that is to be had here. So, but Rufus again goes and breaks freaking Wiley's teeth. And so eventually he's like, hey guys, I found gold. Like, kids are scrambling, grabbing teeth, running off. So eventually Rufus is to basically tell this town, it's like, hey, I want a huge payout. Like, I want a huge, like 50,000, I think, payout right now, for you guys to just live here because I've let you live here. So one person is to kind of contradict what Rufus is to say, and immediately this guy ends up getting shot. To really just have, if anybody was to say a word against Rufus, there were to be easy points of just saying, well, somebody's going to get killed here, so you might as well just nod your head and say whatever you want unless you're going to run yourself out of this town, and then more than likely you're probably going to get shot anyways. So either way, probably death is to happen or befall or put upon you. So so now at the saloon, back at the saloon, we eventually have Nat, who's eventually meet this sheriff who's to be called Bass Reeves. I'm hoping it's Bass Reeves. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. So Reeves is to go and tell Nat, it's like, well, hey, I want us to team up together to eventually go after Rufus and like go after him because he's probably going to be a big, huge bounty. And so Nat is like, okay, like, all right, that sounds like strength in numbers. And so eventually we end up having all of Nat's gang eventually, of course, join with both Bass and Nat because, again, like, just the more the merrier. Where eventually Mary Fields eventually joins with the group, and eventually their plan is to have Mary Fields go in there first to try and buy out the saloon or the bar that that Rufus is in. And they just kind of just like, really? Like, you aren't going to just buy out this bar from us. It's like, you came in here with a lot of confidence, but we also know that you're tied to Nat Love. And so, like, don't think we're stupid here. So, so eventually we get a point where, of course, we can consistently have Jim Beckworth, who, of course, a lot of people probably know from the Power Rangers reboot movie that didn't go that far. Sadly, I wish that, man, like, there was some potential with that, but like when Power Rangers consistently just keeps shifting from company to company to company, and like they just keep juggling that ball, and they really just, I think, way too often rely on the fact that they would rather just do the show and just consistently keep burning that out. To eventually not put Power Rangers in different mediums besides comic books because, or mobile games, because I guess that's all they're fine with. Man, Power Rangers needs to do something to like breathe new life into that, and they're never going to. But why am I talking about Power Rangers? Uh, but Jim Beckworth is to eventually mention how he's the fastest gun in the West. and everybody used to mention, well, Cherokee Bill, and he's like, Cherokee Bill, I don't know about that. So we also have Cuffy or Coffee. I want to say it's Cuffy, but I want to say Coffee because it just like that ill pronouncing just is to be awful. But it's Cuffee, Cuffy. So this woman, which we end up having to find out as a woman because it seems like there's like mystery afoot of whether this Cuffy is a woman or not, which is like, well, it's obvious that she is. But anyways, this woman is to say that she is to, of course, be a faster gun than Jim is, and that eventually, looking at the mirror, she knows who the fastest gun is. So like you would have thought they would easily had a contest where it's just like, okay, line up two cans and like whoever shoots the can first wins. And like you would have thought that that would have been like the easiest way to determine that. But maybe they didn't have any cans on them. They could have had a stick of wood and shot a stick of wood. That would have worked. But whatever. Anyways, so I would have just liked to have seen who was the fastest. Because it seems that again, we're probably gonna have Cherokee Bill going, doing some trickery afoot. So we go on and we have Fields who ends up going into the lion's den to eventually just get herself freaking choked by this rope. And then eventually we have just really a lot of time uh, with her and Trudy, where Trudy is to mention about this story about this apple, and like while she's like carving up this apple, she's mentioning this story, and eventually we have Fields who is to just kind of get put into this jail cell until the rest of her gang is to arrive. And so eventually Fields is to be put out in the field, so to speak, to immediately just say like, well, hey, like we're gonna put her in the middle of the field to make an example of her, and if her friends don't come within the next like supposedly 24 hours, we're gonna shoot her in the middle of the field out here. And so all of a sudden, once coincidentally they end up doing that, all of a sudden the friends of Fields is to come in. Like, well, I guess we're not going to wait too long now, are we? So when we go into this, basically, we easily have it to where Nat, because of Fields being here, Nat just kind of has to give up and goes into prison and gets tied up and beat up. And so Rufus ends up coming in and is to basically tell Nat the reason why he gave him that scar was because that way he could recognize him, because he wouldn't, because he was a much younger kid. And plus Rufus knew that this kid was eventually going to come back to seek revenge, because why wouldn't he have? So Rufus is to say to Nat that they need to go and rob a bank to be able to make amends for what they have done here. So Rufus also gives Nat a consolation prize for coming here, which is basically that same razor that he ended up getting his scar from his forehead from. And so Nat ends up going off to eventually go with his team to go and rob this bank. And so it doesn't go off the easiest. If anything, the bank tellers are kind of laughing at this woman while like this whole thing is going on. Let me pause here for a second. All right. So the group ends up going Nat Love's group ends up going to arrest this bank. They end up coming back to eventually just have it be that the whole robbing the bank thing was all for naught. Like, we really have these like horse and buggy things that have these like explosionary things to kind of catch the villains off guard to eventually lead to them having a gunfight. A point when both both really just certain people are wanting to prove that their counterpart is to like eventually be as good as they are. Like, of course, we have Jim Buckworth, who is to eventually go and fight against Cherokee Bill, uh, eventually having him eventually doing this whole countdown thing, where eventually they're going to draw their guns. Cherokee Bill is to mention how Jim is to count too long and shoots him in the face, killing him off. So eventually we have later where eventually Bill is to unfortunately get shot in the back. Bill Pickett is get shot in the back by Cherokee Bill, and so now Cuffy has to go and take out supposedly Cherokee Bill because she's probably the fastest gun, and so she's going to eventually take him out, which of course she does. Uh, Eventually we have Trudy, who's eventually going to, of course, get taken out here. And so, really, all that really leaves us left to do is eventually, of course, having the Rufus and Nat kind of thing here, kind of squaring off, which actually just, like, for how this movie ends, it kind of, like, ends weakly, like weak. It has a weakness to it because Rufus is to finally confront Nat and tell him a story about how supposedly Rufus's father was a drunk and never really treated his family right, to the point of eventually this guy going off running off on this family, and eventually Rufus found out that his father was to eventually have another wife, another son, and coincidentally, Rufus was to have changed, or Rufus's father was to eventually change his name to Love. So now Nat Love realizes that him and Rufus are brothers, and now Rufus is telling Nat to get his revenge, to shoot him, to kill him, because Rufus doesn't care because he had gotten his revenge on his father, and I guess that's all he ever wanted, right? So eventually Nat doesn't want to shoot Rufus because of him finding out that technically he's his brother, but eventually he shoots him anyways. And then eventually they go on and they are to bury all the people, and so eventually they end up burying Nat Love. And so we have this question of like, okay, so is Nat Love really buried? And the sheriff is just like, well, like, hey, if I say Nat Love is buried, Nat Love is buried. So we have it where reasonably, I think Nat doesn't even change his name, I guess, to Nat Buck. Like, you would have thought that that would have probably been the one thing to have him do. I guess to really just say, like, well, that was my real name all along. Like, whole Love thing was a fabrication, but I guess he ends up keeping the Nat Love name. So eventually, after this moment, everybody who is technically left is to just kind of ride off into the sunset, and like that's how the movie is just to fade off and end in whichever. Really, there's a whole lot of dialogue that I kind of skipped around about because this movie is just like it's 2 hours of not all that interesting. but eventually it's another Western, which that's a very rare thing nowadays to have put together. But again, it's not a unique enough one. Um, Eventually, it'll be interesting to see what any other time, like, it'd be cool to see like a futuristic styled Western, like a futuristic styled Western movie, because I don't think we have that. Like, I don't remember us having that often, where you kind of have like a movie that's like, I always like, for some reason for me, I'm like hankering for like a futuristic kind of film, much more so than either like a current kind of time kind of thing, or like something done in the past. Like, I would rather be fascinated by a futuristic looking movie, which has all kinds of technology and whatever, because I don't think that we get that enough lately. And people could contradict that, like, oh no, we have enough of those films. Uh, like, we probably have ones that are probably to, oh, like, what are all the, like, the post-apocalyptic kind of things where it's like we have technologies and whatever, like, but like we don't have like we could probably have a lot of space kind of films or whatever, but like we don't have like future technology kind of films all that often, where it's like, yeah, we can have a Star Wars or a Star Trek or whatever, but like, anyways, pushing on. I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.